Hey everyone, Happy New Year, and we want to say Happy New Year and welcome to the very first Radiotopia Presents of 2024. It's a series that we are truly excited about. It's called Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. Now, this is from documentarian Jess Shane, who put out an open call on Craigslist and then worked with 4 strangers to explore the standard rules that documentarians and journalists use to tell their subject stories. So the series gets into all sorts of questions about what happens when people's real lives are collected, edited, and consumed. The show pulls back the curtain on what goes on behind the scenes of your favorite nonfiction shows. And then it turns in on itself and some really interesting twists and turns along the way in the making of the show. I've gotten to know Jess a little bit over the making of this show. Every time I chat with her, there's a new wrinkle to this story. It is really incredible. So go check out the new Radiotopia Presents series, Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. It is out now on your favorite podcast platform. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, October 16th, 1968. Yes, again with 1968. What can we say? It was a very big year. Anyway, on this day, October 16th, 1968, 2 Black American athletes, Tommie Smith and John Carlos, raised a gloved fist in the air as they stood on the Olympic podium as the national anthem played. I would imagine many of you have this image in your head of Smith and Carlos on that podium at the moment, head down, arm raised. So let's talk a little bit about how we got to that moment, what came next, the legacy of Smith and Carlos, and obviously sports and activism, a huge theme in 2020 as well. So here to discuss is, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Columbia. Hello, Nikki.
Hello, Jody.
And back with us for one more episode is Joel Anderson of Slate. Hang Up and Listen, Slow Burn, and lots more. Joel, thank you for doing this.
Oh, thanks. Track is my thing, so thanks for having me.
Oh, God. So you brought it up before I brought it up. So listeners, let me give you some context here. We'll just get this out of the way. Joel likes to claim that he was a very, very fast kid, ran track, likes to claim. He will now claim
it was a
that
claim, but okay.
It's not a claim.
Yeah.
Their record.
Truth. Joel, you have 30 seconds to talk about how fast you were if you bring it back to Smith and Carlos and talk about how fast they were running the 200 in 1968.
Ooh, okay, I think I can do that. So in 1988, I was the fastest 10-year-old in the country. I couldn't run at the national meet in Gainesville that year because we went to another meet, and so we couldn't afford to go to that meet. But I got a certificate from the Amateur Athletic Union stipulating that I had run the fastest 100-meter dash that year in my age group. So I take that with a lot of... And you know what? In one of those meets, the person that gave me my gold medal was Bob Beamon at the regional meet. And so, of course, he was at the 1968 Olympics meet where he, did that crazy long jump that set the world record and was there for a while. So, so that's how you get to Tom.
You did it, John.
And John Carlos, because they were all there together. Yes.
Yes. But Joel, but seriously, 1968, you didn't run the 200, right? What made you the fastest 10-year-old in America?
Well, winning the 100, I ran the 200 in high school, not as a child.
But these guys were running the 200. We were saying this before we started taping, but like their time was really good, still really good.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of that is probably attributable to the high altitude of Mexico, right? Because a lot of crazy records, like the aforementioned Bob Beamon, I mean, he shattered the long jump world record in such a way that it took probably like 40 years for somebody to actually break it again. So the times that they ran, which 19.8 is the time that Tommie Smith ran that day, which was a world record that stood for, I think, until Pietro Minea from Italy set it in the Olympics a few years later. But yeah, man, I mean, it was just crazy. I mean, the times they were running, given the conditions, given how long ago it was, it's unbelievable that somebody ran 19.83 in 1968. That would win you a lot of meets today as a sprinter.
Yeah.
So.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the protest itself, and then we'll back up to some of the context and then some of the legacy, because I think there are a lot of specific details about this image, as lasting as it is and as seared as it is into many people's memories. I think there's also a lot of stuff about it that we don't remember. Just in researching, there's some real remarkable stuff. So, Joel, do you want to talk a little bit about the other types of protests that were happening at the same Olympics and even on that podium itself?
Well, I mean, I didn't know that there were a backdrop of protests going on in Mexico. Like even like then, all the conversations that people have today about the Olympics, about how a tremendous waste of public expenditures it is, right? And and we seem to think that that's a conversation that we only now have started to have. They were having it back then in Mexico in 1968. So they get there to that. And then, of course, the group that Tommie Smith and John Carlos were members of, the Olympic Project for Human Rights, I mean, they came in with some fairly, ambitious goals, like getting Avery Brundage to step down as the head of the IOC. That's a really ambitious goal for a group of activists, right? I mean, why would he do that? But that was part of their platform, and hiring more Black assistant coaches and getting South Africa and Rhodesia uninvited from the Olympics, and, getting Muhammad Ali's world heavyweight boxing title restored. So they had a really ambitious platform. It all seems reasonable in retrospect, but obviously back then in 1968, that it made them bound to run into some conflict by the time the games actually got started.
Yeah, and the image that sticks with us all, and perhaps because it's so powerful, we miss out on some of these other images and moments of protest that happen. But there was Jim Hines, who was the 100-meter runner, who refuses to shake Brundage's hand. And in part because, Brundage had been one of the people who secured the Olympics for Nazi Germany in 1936. You can understand why people would be hesitant to embrace him. But even in the case of Smith and Carlos, they didn't wear shoes in order to protest Black poverty. Smith wore a scarf around his neck that represented Black pride. Carlos wore beads to represent the people that had been lynched and killed in the U.S. And so there's a deep level of protest that's happening here. It's about sports, absolutely, but it's also couched in a much broader protest movement that was happening in the U.S., but that was happening, as Joel pointed out, all over the world in 1968.
And I mean, it's interesting to think about the mix of the protests, and I think we should keep this in mind when looking at current protest movements. A lot of the protest was about the IOC itself, and people addressing the sort of world that they inhabit, as people do. And I think it's important when you look to movements to also recognize the internal dynamics within a movement. And so much, and often that is the thing that is the engine behind the protest. But then obviously the larger context of protests, as we're discussing, and I think this is where we can talk a little bit about the power of protesting during the national anthem. I think Carlos and Smith knew the attention they were going to get by taking this stand in this moment. One detail that just jumps out to me, Joel, is just so interesting. I've thought a lot about kind of what a protest during a national anthem means, obviously. For some reason, a lot of the reports point out that they faced the flag during their protest, and it occurred to me that I wonder if they ever thought about turning their back on the flag. And like so many of these little moments of symbology have such a huge impact, but I think it I don't know, to me it says something that they faced the flag, right, during their protest.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the thing is that had they been, I mean, they made a decision to go. I mean, there were athletes that did not go to the 1968. Notable among them, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, right? He set out the 1968 Olympics at that time. So they went there with the intention of making a statement to their country, and they weren't going to turn their back. I don't want to impute, these are the motives on what they did, right? But I think that it says a lot that they were we're face forward. We're taking on injustice in our country head on. We're looking right at you. And so I don't, maybe there was an argument to be made for turning away from the flag. But yeah, I find that to be really powerful that, they stood up there, right there, knowing that, the entire Olympic Stadium. I mean, anybody that's been to an Olympic event and sees the way that it's laid out there, I mean, they knew that it was going to be extremely powerful. I'm actually sort of surprised that they didn't think that they might be assassinated or killed, within whether from the time they left the medal stand to getting out of the Olympic Village or whatever, because it's such a powerful moment. I mean, even today, just looking at it, it's just, you're just struck by the courage it must have taken for them to have done that in that moment.
Yeah, I mean, I think that fear of some kind of retaliation or some kind of response, I think Carlos at the time was saying I was trying to slightly shield my face because I didn't know if somebody was going to try to assassinate me for doing this. Keeping in mind that this was a real live possibility that protesters in Mexico had been murdered en masse right before the Olympics started, that there had been political assassinations in the U.S. earlier that year of Martin Luther King Jr. and of Robert Kennedy. So that fear of violent and deadly retaliation was a real fear, and I think underscores the kind of bravery it took for something that today may not seem as risky as it really was.
Well, that point about risk, I think, is what's really important to keep in mind here. And I think whenever you look at an act of protest, particularly around athletes, I think asking this question of what is actually on the line, what are you actually risking here, is really important. And so, with Smith and Carlos, well, for one, there's reporting that actually the IOC had sent Jesse Owens, of all people, to tell them that they should not boycott and they should go. And reportedly, Jesse Owens told one of the members of the U.S. track team, if you protest, you're never going to have a job again. And the guy responded like, I already don't have a job. And so thinking about kind of what are you putting on the line. But Smith and Carlos, another thing that people I think don't really remember about them, they had aspirations to be pro football players, right? You're not going to make a living in 68, I don't think, as a track athlete, but there are other places where you can make money as an athlete, including professional football. Both of them had aspirations to do so, and that was basically squashed after these protests, as far as I can tell, right, Joel?
Yeah, I mean, they both got shots, right? They both got,
right.
But signing with the team, going to training camp, and getting a real opportunity is like real. Obviously, there's a distinction to be made there. So yeah. I can't imagine, given how the NFL has responded to protest in 2020, that they were more progressive in 1968 about a couple of guys who had, taken a very public stand against their country and racial injustice in it, right? But even beyond that, I mean, the guy, Peter Norman, who finished second in the 200, I mean, he's not from America, he's from Australia. He risked a hell of a lot, too. And, he never really got back on track for participating along with those guys as well. I mean,
well, and there's a great documentary about him, is that right? Or there's some great piece about him that just sort of looks at things from his perspective. But yeah, and I mean, again, this question of like, what are you actually putting on the line and what are you actually risking? And Joel, I mean, I wonder how you think about that in modern context, because I think that certainly Colin Kaepernick, we see the price he paid, and the risk that he took. But not that much later, right? You look at an athlete like LeBron James, who is willing to speak out. And I would say a lot of that is because he has his beliefs, but a lot of that is also because he realizes, like, you can't really touch him. He makes enough money that he's not really risking that much by being pretty political. And so I wonder how you think what you're risking plays into these calculations.
Yeah, LeBron is in so much of a different position. And a lot of the NBA guys are, right? Because it's a league that's majority black and a league that ostensibly needs a black audience to help support the league, right? And that's totally different from the NFL, where, Colin Kaepernick has obviously not had his chance. But I even think about Eric Reed, the guy who was Colin Kaepernick's teammate, was in the NFL as recently as a year ago, but has been very public in calling out the NFL and the country and, on racism and institutional racism. And right now, a year after he was one of the best safeties in the league, he can't get a call. Like, he's out of the league right now, right? So there's still a lot to put in line. And then even if you're just keeping it within the Olympics, you've got Gwen Berry, who's one of the top female hammer throwers in the country. I think last year she made the medal stand at the Pan Am Games and raised her fist. And now she's unsponsored. Like, she's lost a lot of money, lost the support of the IOC, hasn't received any athletic grants since protesting last year. And I mean, you know what I mean? Like, you would think that, like, we would have moved beyond this, right? That we would acknowledge that people have the right to protest, but obviously sports leagues and their sponsors are showing you that, no, we will still punish you if you're willing to take a step out there. So it makes what happened in 1968 all the more remarkable to me, because their literal lives were on the line, whereas just now it's livelihoods, it seems.
Yeah, I just want to throw in another protester from the 1960s here, because I think it gives you a sense of, yes, these athletes were risking a lot. They also understood that at these moments of Olympic triumph, they had an international audience like they may never experience again in their life. And they were going to use that moment in order to try to affect some kind of change. And in 1960, Wilma Rudolph comes home with 3 gold medals. And she insists that her victory parade in Clarksville, Tennessee is integrated. And it's the first integrated public event in Clarksville in 1960. And so, there is this way that there can be this effective change. But of course, as you were just saying, Joel, it comes at such a tremendously high cost. And those athletes understand that cost, and they do it anyway.
Let's talk a little bit about just the specific legacy of Carlos and Smith. I mean, Joel, what's your sense of how much they are thought of as, forefathers? Are they counseling in this new era of athlete activism? Are people connecting with them, and what is their actual role here in 2020?
Yeah, I mean, I think they're definitely forefathers of the athletic protest movement, right? Or they're considered that way. I mean, they've got a statue, right down the street from me at San Jose State. They're legends. I mean, there have been documentaries and books written about them. They've gotten their due somewhat. But I think like with anything, I mean, that was 52 years ago. So some of that fades a little bit. Now Colin Kaepernick is the face of athletic protest in this country. And I know that they've been in consultation with Colin, though. I know that they've met and spoken with each other. So it's good to see that they're still involved, and like Dr. Harry Edwards, who helped to organize some of the activism around that 1968 Olympics, is still involved in these conversations. But it's a long time. I doubt very few sports fans today remember them in quite the way we do. I mean, I'm old. I'm 40. Of course, I'm going to remember it in a way that a 24-year-old doesn't. But in time, I mean, obviously their influence probably wanes a little bit, which is sort of sad. I mean, we were talking about this earlier. Like, I think it would be really powerful if Tommie Smith and John Carlos were like closer, if they were like friends and like they could travel together and go places and do events together. But it just doesn't seem like they have that sort of relationship. And they've even like sort of hinted at that over the years, right?
Yeah, I mean, they were, I guess, brought together by this moment. It's hard to separate it. But I mean, just because you're teammates on the same Olympic team doesn't mean you have to be best buds, right?
Right. Well, they were competitors, right? So,
right, exactly. Yeah. Well, that also brings up one other little tidbit that gets lost to history and is sort of an interesting moment here, which is, Niki, there is some reporting here that is it Smith who claims that he let Carlos actually win this race? So,
yeah, the other way around.
The other way around?
Yeah.
Okay.
So Smith sets the world record. And Carlos, who is like the much more extroverted, much more big man on campus energy strutting around, is just like, oh yeah, I'll let you win, which is such a shitty thing to say to somebody who has just smoked you in a race, right?
And set a world record, by the way.
Right. Yeah. Like, oh, well, I could have won, but I didn't care as much about winning a gold medal as Smith did. Anyway, so, and still, I mean, to this day, kind of razzes him about it when, on the rare occasion that they're actually sharing the same space. So maybe it was a bit, maybe not, but he has kept it going for decades now.
But doesn't he also claim that if he had won, then the protest wouldn't have happened, that because he would have been so pissed off he wouldn't have gone through the protest or something? I feel like
he floats something like that,
yeah.
But I don't think we need to take him at his word on that.
Well, I mean, The thing is that they were both involved in the same organization, right? Like, right. I mean, it's not like he had not taken part in any of that other activism stuff and then just showed up. So, and it's actually to, I mean, Tommie's credit. I mean, John Carlos is the one that forgot his other glove, that forgot his gloves. You know what I'm saying?
So okay, this is another, like, if you do a close semiotic analysis of the photo, right, you see that one of them has his right fist up and the other one has his left fist up because they were both supposed to bring two gloves, but then someone forgot one?
Yeah,
right?
John Carlos forgot his gloves, and so that's why they had to split gloves. So
split gloves.
Yeah, and the person whose idea it was Peter Norman, the guy who finished a second. So I could just imagine them standing out there on the infield of the track, like, Tommie being like, "Hey, I got my gloves, so I don't know."
Well, it's a reminder that even remarkable people in amazing moments who do just incredible things can also just space out from time to time, and I find some comfort in that. And be forgetful. All right, we're going to leave John Carlos and Tommie Smith there, but let's do a few of these also on this days, which we like to do from time to time. So also on this day, in 1871, President Grant suspended habeas corpus in South Carolina while going after the Ku Klux Klan.
Good for Grant.
Yeah, imagine having a president who wants to go after the Ku Klux Klan. That's amazing.
1931, Al Capone famously convicted of tax evasion. The jokes just write themselves. Go ahead.
Look, somebody gets convicted of tax evasion, even when it's not their worst crime.
Right. But this is the famous thing, right, about Al Capone. They couldn't get him on all the mobster stuff, so they went after him on tax evasion. Whereas, in our current situation, maybe Donald Trump's worst crimes are related to his taxes, and they actually sort of do show a lot of the core problems. But yes, a reminder. And then, and actually another moment of that was fairly recently was the anniversary of Agnew resigning over tax problems.
Oh, yeah, that's
we haven't
right.
talked about on the show. But yes, another reminder that you can resign from elected office if you get in tax trouble.
If you have shame. You have to have shame. That's a really important element.
That's
right.
The missing ingredient.
Right.
1945, the Soviet nuclear program was handed plans for the United States plutonium bomb from a man named Klaus Fuchs. I don't know this person's name. Niki, tell us about Klaus Fuchs.
Klaus Fuchs was a Soviet spy who had gotten into the Los Alamos National Laboratory. He was working in the nuclear program, and he sneaks those plans out, and it's how the Soviets end up getting a nuclear weapon so quickly. It had been anticipated that they wouldn't get one for 20 years, and they have one by the end of the decade.
We've done very few spying stories on this show. I think we got to correct that. We got to find some spy.
That's
some
fascinating.
Spy tales.
They didn't cover that in my history classes in school. So,
did they talk about Tommie Smith and John Carlos?
No, I didn't get to that either, unfortunately.
Yeah. All right. We're going to leave it there. Joel Anderson of Slate, thank you so much.
Oh, man, it was a lot of fun. I got to talk about being the fastest 10-year-old in the country. It's great.
Bringing it full circle. So obviously you're on Hang Up and Listen every week, and people can still go find Slow Burn. What else? Anything else you got brewing?
I'm working on a long sports narrative project right now that should hopefully be out within the next few weeks. I don't want to say too much about it, but just keep a look on the Hang Up and Listen feed because it might show up instead of one of those episodes in the coming weeks.
All right, and Nicole Hammer of Columbia, thanks to you.
Thanks, Jody.
This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of the Radiotopia network from PRX. Our producer and researcher is Jacob Feldman. Our other producer is Brittany Brown. My name is Jody Avirgan. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you soon.
Do you think the Olympic Games are the right place to do this kind of thing? You ought to use this as a world stage?
We use this so the whole world could see the poverty of the black man in America.
Cynics might say that you've got it all. You've got publicity, you've got medals, you've got martyrdom as well. What are you going to say to that?
I can't eat that, and the kids around my block, they grew up with me, they can't eat it. And the kids that's going to grow up after them, they can't eat publicity, they can't eat gold medals, as Tommie Smith said. All we ask for is an equal chance to be a human being.
Radiotopia from